5. Hi, my name is Donna Yates. My pronouns are she, her, and this is Working with People in the LGBTQ plus community. So why do we say LGBTQ plus anyway? Because it's a whole lot easier than saying LGBTQIAAP, and it's always subject to change anyway. So let's go back and talk about all these letters and talk about what they mean. So L is for lesbian. I'm sorry, every time I start that, all I can think of is Sesame Street, and I expect to hear Sesame Street music playing. L is for lesbian. Oh, L is for lesbian, so let's go back to that. A lesbian is a woman who finds other women sexually attractive. G is for gay, and is predominantly referred to as a man who finds other men sexually attractive. But now it's become an umbrella term for both men and women, and you hear the term lesbian less and less. B is for bisexual. A person who is bisexual finds both men and women sexually attractive. T is for transgender. A person who is transgender does not agree with the sex or gender that they were assigned at birth. The other T is for transsexual, and that's an outdated term that's not used anymore. It used to be that a person who is transsexual did not agree with the sex or gender that they were assigned at birth and had had sex-affirming surgery. But we don't use that anymore because anyone who does not agree with the sex or gender they were assigned at birth is transgender, because that's an identity and it has nothing to do with whether that person has had any kind of sex-affirming surgery or not. Q is for queer, and queer is a reclaimed word that used to be derogatory. And now it's used to refer to the LGBTQ plus community, because a lot of times it's a lot quicker and easier to say the queer community than the LGBTQ plus community. The other Q is for questioning. Some people know that they belong in this community somewhere, but they haven't quite figured out where they fit in. So they are part of the community, but they are questioning. I is for intersex. A person who is intersex is born with genitalia that's not clearly male or female. Now, it used to be when a child was born intersex, the doctors and the parents would decide right then and there what gender or sex they were going to raise that child as, and then they would do any kind of surgery that was necessary at that time. But sometimes they weren't right. Sometimes they were actually raising a child as the wrong gender or sex, and that was so confusing for children and adults who had been raised basically as the wrong gender. So now children who are born intersex are allowed to decide sometime when they start growing what sex, gender they're going to be. A is for ally. An ally is a person who is not part of the LGBTQ plus community, but fights very hard to make sure that people who do belong to this community are treated fairly and with respect. The other A is for asexual, and a person who is asexual does not have a strong sex drive. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong. That is simply how they are, and it's not something that needs to be changed. It also doesn't mean that they're not loving, and it doesn't mean necessarily that they don't have a sexual partner. A lot of times people who are asexual, when they take part in sexual activity, they're more the giver than the taker. But still, there are a lot of different subgroups who are asexual. But the important thing is to know that there's nothing wrong with somebody who does not have a strong sex drive. And P is for pansexual, who is a person who can find anyone attractive, and it doesn't matter what sex or gender they are. Now, there are a few more words that are also very important. Now, some of these we've already talked about. We talked about queer and asexual and ally and LGBTQ+, and pansexual and intersex. But let's talk about gender identity, because that's not written in stone. Your gender identity is your sex that you were assigned at birth, but it is an identification. Your gender identity is an identification, and it may or may not agree with the sex or gender you were assigned at birth. Now, if you do agree with the sex or gender you were assigned at birth, you are cisgender. Now, pronouns are also very important. If you'll remember, when I first started this program, I introduced myself as Donna Yates, and I said that my pronouns are she, her. Pronouns are very important now, because some people choose to be referred to not as she, her, or he, him, but as they, them. And that can be pretty confusing for some people, because we think of they and them as strictly meaning plural. But Merriam-Webster in 2019 said that they, them were the words for the year, and that indeed they could now refer to a singular person without referring to a particular gender. Because gender can be non-binary, just as sexual orientation can be non-binary. And what does that mean? That means you don't have to be either or. You don't have to be either male or female, and you don't have to be either gay or straight. And that's something that we'll talk about in just a few minutes in our program. So why is it all important? Because of gay pride. Because in 1969, when it was still illegal to be gay, bars that had a lot of gay people in them were regularly raided. But at the Stonewall Inn in 1969, the people fought back, and there were riots. So now, every year, on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, that's when you see a lot of gay pride parades. And now, because of gay rights, you can't be fired for being gay. People can marry somebody who's the same sex as they are, and that's now legal. And people don't have to hide who they are anymore. If being gay is part of your identity, if being trans is part of your identity, there's no reason anymore for you to have to hide that from other people. Now, let's talk a little bit about social media and some of the positive effects on social media, because a lot of times we talk mostly about the negative stuff. But a lot of times, youth who don't quite fit in with all the other friends, they know there's something different about themselves, they have a lot of questions about their sexuality, their sexual orientation, or their gender, and they don't know who to turn to. And that can be very isolating, and that can bring on a lot of depression and even feelings of suicide. But because of social media, they can find the information that they need, and they can find friends who feel the same way that they do. And once you have friends, you have a community. And once you have a community, you feel like you belong. And having a community can lessen depression, and it can even save lives. So let's talk a little bit about gender identity. People are assigned a sex or gender at birth. And a lot of times we use sex and gender the same, but it doesn't always have to be. So your sex assigned at birth is male or female, and we talked about people who weren't clearly male or female as being intersex. But gender is traditional sex roles, more along the lines of masculine and feminine. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, when there was a lot of research going on, they decided that some people were kind of in the middle. They had both masculine tendencies and feminine tendencies, and those people were considered androgynous. But still, you can see the binary here. Basically, it's male, female, masculine, or feminine, and you can be somewhere in the middle, but it's always basically the one or the other. But what if that doesn't work for some people? So we started looking at gender identity as being separate from any other identity, such as male, female, or other. So if you feel very feminine or female, you might identify somewhere on a scale of 0 to 10 because it's on its own scale. So you may be a 6 or a 7 or an 8, and that can also change from day to day. Some days you might feel more female than others, and some days you might feel a little less female or feminine than others. But what about your male identity? Well, that also falls on a scale of 0 to 10, and it has nothing to do with your female identity. So wherever your female identity falls has nothing to do with where your male identity falls, and it can be 5 or 6 or 7 on any given day. And what about other? What about feeling like you don't really have a gender? Again, that can be on a scale of 0 to 10 and has nothing to do with the other gender identities. Now, why did we talk about a lot of this, and why are we making changes? Now, I would like to introduce you to my friend, the gender unicorn. The gender unicorn was designed for youth who were having problems finding themselves and their correct gender and their sexual orientation. And for a lot of kids in school, it was so lonely and so confusing when they knew they just didn't fit in with other kids. Now, you might also have seen a gender gingerbread person. I always kind of trip over that. But I like the gender unicorn the best. The gender unicorn has no gender, but a really big heart. So now you can see that gender identity on its own scales from 0 to 10 as female, male, or other. And wherever you fall on any of these scales has nothing to do with where you fall on another scale. So you could be male from 0 to 10. Today, maybe a 3 or 4, and maybe at the same time, your female identity is a 5 or a 6, because they have nothing to do with each other. Now, gender expression is what other people see. And people may see you dressed very femininely. They might see you dressed very masculinely. Or they might see you dressed as other and not be able to tell, looking at you, whether you're male or female. And again, each is separate. And this is what people see. So you might dress in a very feminine manner, but that does not mean you identify as feminine. So let's talk about being physically and sexually attracted to other people. And let's put that on its own separate scales too. Because if you're attracted to females, if you're attracted to women sexually, that might have absolutely nothing to do with how attractive you are to men, or how attracted you are to people who are other. And each of these can be on their own scale of 0 to 10. Even emotional attachment can be on its own scale. Who are you emotionally attracted to? Men, women, or other, and one does not have to do with the other. You can be emotionally attracted to men anywhere on a scale of 0 to 10, or emotionally attracted to women, again on a scale of 0 to 10, or emotionally attracted to people who don't identify as either male or female. And this gender unicorn has made such a difference for youth who are having a lot of trouble, particularly finding a gender that they could identify with. Now, a landmark study found that 39% of gay and bisexual youth and more than half of transgender youth reported having seriously considered suicide in the past 12 months. That's horrendous. We already know that youth do have high rates of suicidal thoughts and suicidal actions, but this is very high. This is very high. So this was the Trevor Project, and this was happening in 2019, so the information is pretty current. And the Trevor Project surveyed 34,000 youth that already identified as LGBTQ+. And these youth were in high school and middle school. And they asked them a whole bunch of questions. And some of the questions were yes-no questions. Some of the questions were answered on a scale of 0 to 7 or 0 to 10. And some of the questions were left open. And 2 of the questions that were left open were gender identity and sexual orientation. So it was up to them to describe themselves. What they found was over 100 of each gender identity and sexual orientations. This is why pronouns are so important. And this is why it's important to understand that for people who live in the LGBTQ+ community, this is their orientation, this is their gender identity, this is their reality. And it doesn't matter if it's the same reality that I have or somebody else has, because what is your reality is your reality. And using the chosen names and chosen pronouns reduces the odds of depression and suicide in transgender youth. Researchers have consistently found that when transgender youth are allowed to use their chosen name and pronouns in their workplaces, their school, and at home, depression and suicide significantly drops. That's how important names and pronouns are. And a lot of times in families, if somebody decides to transition to another gender, all their life they're still referred to as that first gender or the first name, and that means they're not going to feel loved and accepted. If somebody makes that decision that it's important for them to transition to another gender, that needs to be respected, and that needs to be used according to how the person wants it used, because that is so important in lessening depression and suicide ideation. So be prepared. The best way to support LGBTQ plus individuals is with compassion and understanding. And in the handouts that you should have, I have listed some hotlines and also some websites that were designed for helping people who are having problems with gender or sexual orientation, and also the National Suicide Hotline for anyone who needs someone to talk to. If a person is feeling suicidal, they need to have somebody they can talk to right now. And there's always somebody available on the suicide hotlines. So when you're working with patients or clients who belong to the LGBTQ plus community, keep your handouts close by. They've got a lot of words in them. They have the gender unicorn, and they have a list of numbers and websites that could indeed save lives. So thank you for being part of my program. Again, my name is Donna Yates, and my pronouns are she, her.